Whatever happened to Herbert W. Armstrong? Whatever happened to the important message he preached and the church that was built as a result? On today's program, let's dive into the revealing answers to those questions.
The World Tomorrow. The Signet Church of God presents Brian Weeks, proclaiming the good news of the world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian D. Weeks.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the World Tomorrow 2 program. If we want to learn more about what happened to Herbert Armstrong, then it's going to help to know a little bit more about who he was and what he did. First and foremost, Herbert Armstrong was a true servant of the living God who served as a minister, an educator, and a charismatic influencer when it came to biblical truth. And he did so for over 50 years. In 1933, Mr. Armstrong started the World Tomorrow program, the forefather of this program, if you please. He began his broadcasting career on radio station KORE in Eugene, Oregon. Using that platform, Mr. Armstrong preached the gospel, or good news of the coming kingdom of God. And because his message was so unique, and because his speaking style was so effective, his broadcasting efforts quickly bore fruit. He generated keen interest within the broadcast footprint of that tiny 100-watt radio station. Word of mouth quickly spread as well. So not long after his launch, the Radio Church of God was founded in order to accommodate his growing listening audience, as well as to further nurture those who wanted to learn more in person. And because he was not following the herd by preaching the traditional message about the messenger, Mr. Armstrong's Bible-based message about the return of Jesus Christ and the establishment of God's kingdom here on earth found very fertile ground in the beautiful Willamette Valley of the Pacific Northwest. Now, being a marketing and advertising man by trade, Mr. Armstrong was never slow to advance God's work when such an opportunity presented itself. In other words, he was always keen on leveraging the available technology of his day in order to grow God's work more quickly. For instance, as improvements in radio tech came along, like improved methods for recording programs, options for networking stations, adding more powerful stations as budget allowed, he was able to advance things quite quickly. It soon became possible to expand his broadcasting reach beyond the Pacific Northwest, beyond the entire Pacific coast, until eventually all of the United States was able to tune in to the World Tomorrow program. And then all of North America. And by the early 1950s, the World Tomorrow program was being aired in Europe. And eventually, all of the civilized world gained access to Jesus Christ's own message, the good news of the world tomorrow. Then, in 1955, Mr. Armstrong ventured into the latest and greatest technology of the mid-20th century, television. Meanwhile, as interest in the World Tomorrow program continued growing, and as church membership continued to increase, the name of the church Mr. Armstrong had started with was aptly updated from Radio Church of God to the Worldwide Church of God. But it wasn't just broadcasting that built God's church during those remarkable decades of exploding interest in the World Tomorrow program. No, in 1934, Mr. Armstrong also launched the Plain Truth magazine as supportive reading material for his broadcast. Indeed, this published version of Christ's gospel message had been originally conceived as a means to further educate and reinforce what his growing radio audience was learning about God's purpose for mankind on the World Tomorrow program. In 1947, Mr. Armstrong also founded the first of 3 Ambassador College campuses in Pasadena, California. Again, being a man of vision, Mr. Armstrong knew early on that a college-educated ministry would be essential in helping to shepherd the burgeoning membership in the Worldwide Church of God. As time went on, 2 more Ambassador College campuses were added to the mix, one in Texas and one in England. These additional college locations helped to graduate even more well-trained manpower in the ministry, as well as for the many administrative and support roles that were being added to the operations at headquarters in Pasadena, in the 12 international offices scattered around the globe, and in the colleges themselves. Now, in addition to providing a top-flight liberal arts education, The mission, or work, of the church was also being ingrained in the minds of all those graduating students, and especially in those who ended up in the ministry. That mission was twofold. First, there was the all-important job of encouraging support in the field churches for the work of the church, that of broadcasting and publishing the good news of God's coming kingdom. Secondly, there was also the never-ending task of building the church. This was installed in the students as well. In practice, building the church meant not only understanding how God brings members into the church, you can see John 6:44 for that, it also meant how the spiritual needs of the membership would be met once they were attending church services. Now, I could certainly go on about Herbert Armstrong's vision and his many accomplishments while at the helm of the Worldwide Church of God, but it's also very important to understand the following about his life before we answer those questions about what happened to his message and church after his death. My friends, it's very important to understand that when Mr. Armstrong came into contact with God's true church in the mid-1920s, the fifth era of the church, called the Sardis Church era in the Bible, it was already in serious decline. We can read about that in the 3rd chapter of the book of Revelation. Let's notice in verses 1 and 2 these very corrective instructions that Christ was giving the 5th church era. And unto the angel of the church of Sardis write, These things saith he that hath the 7 spirits of God, and the 7 stars. I know your works, that you have a name, that you livest, and are dead. Continuing in verse 2, Be watchful and strengthen the things which remained, that are ready to die. For I have not found your works perfect before God. We should be able to tell from these verses that Jesus Christ, the head of the church, was very serious about what he was saying and addressing his church in this manner. But to sharpen our outlook on these verses in a slightly different way, let's consider them in the following light. Have you ever had someone close to you, a friend or relative perhaps, who was very sick? If you have, then you should be able to relate to this example fairly well. You're sitting in the waiting room, waiting for the chance to see your friend or relative, and then the doctor comes up with a very serious look on his face, asking if he might have a word with you in private. Your heart sank, right? Well, we need to see the same level of concern being expressed by God towards his people when we read those first 2 verses of Revelation 3. Jesus Christ was warning his church that they were about to die. But in this case, instead of being a matter of physical life and death, this was the great Creator God speaking directly to his church, telling them that their present spiritual condition was terminal. Now that, my friends, just happens to be the precise state of God's church when Herbert Armstrong came on the scene in the late 1920s. They had lost most of the doctrinal truth that had been established for the church by Christ himself back in the 1st century A.D. They were also fracturing congregationally too, which should never happen in God's true church, especially when we read how the Apostle Paul put it in 1 Corinthians 12:25, that there should be no schism in the body. And as Mr. Armstrong pointed out in his autobiography, they were also impotent as far as proclaiming the God's family gospel message, or in doing any kind of work for that matter that might have helped to build the church. By the way, would you like to know how they could have turned it all around and avoided their church era's demise? Mr. Armstrong figured this out, and that solution, of course, is contained in God's Word. It comes in seeing how Christ trained his chief building engineer, Peter, back in the 1st century A.D. We can see it here in Matthew 16:18. Notice what Christ taught Peter during his 3.5-year apprenticeship program. Verse 18, And I say unto you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell, meaning death, or the grave, shall not prevail against it. Think about that for a second. Historically, we know that both Christ and Peter died, though Christ, of course, was resurrected back to the spirit life after 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. But as verse 18 clearly states, Christ was going to continue building his church until his second coming. And because of that, not even death was going to stop the God family building process. Doesn't knowing that make the Sardis era's tongue lashing a little easier to understand? In other words, as Christ himself was telling Peter in verse 18, his chief building engineer was going to have to be constantly about building God's house right up until the time of Christ's return. And Peter got that message. Notice that once he was converted, Peter wasted no time at all getting busy doing exactly what he had been trained to do. We won't turn there in this program, but if you read through Acts chapter 2, you can see exactly what I mean. Peter and all of the original apostles, trained directly by Christ himself, followed their training and built God's church as instructed. Peter also understood this. He also knew that he was not going to live a long enough physical life to see Christ's return before he died. So in addition to preaching Christ's gospel message and building the church, Peter also took it upon himself to train others how to follow in his footsteps so that God's church or house would continue being built as Christ mandated. But not so with the Sardis church. No, once we fast forward to the bottom half of the fifth church era, we find that somewhere along the line, how to build God's church and the importance of doing so had either been lost or had been severely relegated to the back burner. In any event, this was exactly how Mr. Armstrong found them when he came on the scene in the mid-1920s. The Sardis church was divided, dysfunctional, and dying. But even with their negative mindset, God didn't let them completely fail or die out without sending them a significant helping hand. Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong was that helping hand. Yet they still failed and died out as a church era because they refused to comply with the help God sent. My friends, I hope we can see that there is a powerful warning for us in their failure. We need to accept that help. Here's why I say that. We in the seventh and final church era must never forget what Christ taught and promised Peter in Matthew 16:18, that he would build his church and that not even death, not even the death of an important church era leader like Herbert W. Armstrong, should ever cause us to stop doing our job. This is why it's so important to understand the significance of Mr. Armstrong's arrival on the scene at that critical transitional stage between the Sardis and Philadelphia church eras. Think about it. If those Sardis era ministers and members had only responded correctly, they might have been able to turn things around, or at the very least, they could have smoothly integrated into the sixth church era. Some few actually did, but the vast majority did not. And those overall negative results are there for us to see and to hopefully learn from. One of God's 7 church eras died out. But sadder than that, something even worse happened right after Mr. Armstrong's death in 1986. And this is where we come back to those questions I asked at the beginning of this program. What happened to Mr. Armstrong? What happened to his message? And what happened to the church that was built as a result of that message? In fact, I asked these very same questions on the front cover of this brand new and free book that is now available to you online. It's called Zechariah and the Signet. I'll announce it again at the end of this program. But right now, I'd like to play you a short video clip about this book and its importance for the revival of God's work.
We do not have peace and will not have peace until human nature has been changed.
We have a problem. The church is dysfunctional, it's divided, we're not preaching the gospel message to the world as a witness any longer. What can we do to fix that? What can you do to fix that? What can I do to fix that? My name's Brian Weeks, member of the church for over 40 years, the Church of God, that is. Spent the last number of years writing this little book here to my right called Zechariah and the Signet. This book is for you. This book is for anybody who's ever been in the Worldwide Church of God before or is in any of the scattered churches of God all over the place today. Spent a lot of time figuring out or trying to figure out over these last number of years why we're so disorganized, why we're so scattered, why really there's just a lot of dysfunction in how the church operates. Why did I write this book? The main reason is because after Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong died in January 1986, the church that he basically spent the previous 57 years creating, bringing to bear, doing the gospel message, doing the work of God, basically fell apart. Now today, after nearly 40 years, you've got the Church of God scattered hither and yon. Many different spin-off groups. This is no condition for God's church to be in. As the Bible says, Christ is supposed to return to marry the church. The church is depicted in the Bible as the wife of Jesus Christ. And so if you'd ask the question about what man would want to marry many different women, or perhaps disinterested women, that's not a good condition for marriage. I mean, a man is not going to pick a woman who's disinterested in him or his family business. We've come to a point in time now where the church has to be reunited. It has to get back to doing the work that Mr. Armstrong established. I feel that this book is going to help bridge that gap, help people to take action, help people to get serious again about why they were called in the first place. Serious about being a part of the body of Jesus Christ, the wife of Jesus Christ, when he returns. Now, I consider this book, and there's a couple of different scriptures in the Bible that make this clear, that a time would come when a cry was going to be made. It does indicate that when that cry is made, that the church is going to awaken. But 50% of those who awaken are going to be considered wise, and 50% are going to be considered foolish. If this is that cry, if this is that knock, if you're wise, you're going to respond to this book. You're going to see that there's one place that you need to be. You're going to see that you need to be making yourself ready to marry Jesus Christ at his return. You're going to come to the Signet Church of God. You're going to get involved in this work. We are going to be preaching the gospel message again to the world as a witness, picking up where Mr. Armstrong left off. What Zechariah and the Signet means, the title itself, I guess it's probably going to take some people off guard. And just as, people might wonder who Superman really was. Everybody figured out at some point or another Superman was Clark Kent. I don't really want to tell everybody right now who Zechariah is specifically or who the Signet is specifically. I make that very clear in this book. I explain and go to verses that explain who the Signet is and who Zechariah is. The church that I started out in no longer exists. The man who provided me everything I need to know about the Bible died in 1986. All of that dysfunction, all of that disunity, the splitting of the church has occurred since then. I see that as needing to be fixed. Christ is not going to return and marry many wives, many scattered people all over the earth. The church has to be reunited. It has to be revived as far as understanding what its mission is, and it has to go forward together in that unity, preaching the gospel message to the world as a witness and preparing for Christ's return. Will you be a part of the solution? This book will help you answer it. Zechariah and the Signet. Again, we'll offer this book at the end of the program, so please don't go anywhere. My friends, we have to let this sink in. God's true church was completely on the ropes back in the 1920s, poised to die out. But then God brought Herbert Armstrong on the scene to restore all things to the church doctrinally, and to also start building the church anew, just as Christ had trained Peter to do back in 31 AD. With regard to the restoration of church doctrines, we can see the proof for that in Matthew 17, verses 10 and 11. Starting in verse 10, his disciples asked him, saying, "Why then say the scribes that Elijah must first come?" And Jesus answered and said unto them, verse 11, "Elijah truly shall first come and restore all things." Now we will prove this point in greater detail in future World Tomorrow programs. But for now, we need to understand that these inspired words were intended as New Testament prophecy for our time. In other words, it was clear that John the Baptist came on the scene in his day in the spirit of Elijah to announce Jesus Christ's first coming. But as we read in verse 11, it's important to understand that John restored nothing in his day. That, in fact, would have been impossible. Christ was just starting his ministry and training regimen at that time, so there would have been nothing to restore. In other words, verse 11 has to be referring to an end-time Elijah who would come on the scene near the end of the church age and would take the initiative to restore all things to the church that had been lost since its inception in 31 AD. That, in fact, should be one of the clear takeaways from this program. Herbert Armstrong was that end-time Elijah. Remember, the Sardis era was on life support when he came on the scene. So God not only sent a man who became increasingly keen on understanding the Bible himself, he also sent a man who learned very quickly how to build God's church. And he did that. As God's end-time Elijah, Mr. Armstrong restored all of the true Bible doctrines to the church that had been lost since the end of the first church era. And as God's modern Zerubbabel, Mr. Armstrong also orchestrated the greatest revival of God's work since Christ demonstrated how it was supposed to be done to his original disciples. Indeed, by the time of his death in early 1986, there were hundreds of trained ministers worldwide to teach and encourage the worldwide Church of God membership. There were also hundreds upon hundreds of unified, supportive, and well-fed congregations all over the world as well. By 1985, there were over 100 feast sites worldwide. And by that same time, the World Tomorrow program was airing on over 400 TV stations, and there were over 8 million subscribers receiving the Plain Truth magazine each month. Was God pleased with this effort? I can prove to you that he was. Let's turn now to Revelation 3:11. Behold, I come quickly. Hold that fast which you have, that no man take your crown. Now, to any of you with Church of God experience in your background, have you ever considered what this verse is really saying? Here's what I hear when I read it. I hear God saying that everything we learned from Mr. Armstrong during the 6th church era was tantamount to having solid dibs on a position in God's kingdom as a full-fledged member of the God family. Now, why would anyone ever want to let that mentality die out? And yet, very shortly after his death, along came the Laodicean church era, and chaos ensued. As a result, and in short, God's church quickly became entirely dysfunctional and started dividing into many smaller factions. And if you thought Christ's corrective comments to the Sardis church era were intense when it failed, how about these choice words aimed directly at his final church era? Let's read Revelation 3, verses 15 through 17. To the Laodicean church era, I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I would you were cold or hot. So then, because you are lukewarm, verse 16, and neither cold nor hot, I will spew you out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing, verse 17, and know not that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. Strong words, those. To me, they don't sound pleasant at all, especially that part about being spit out of God's mouth. But then again, like any loving father, we have to realize that God will always intervene to correct his people if they are stuck in self-destructive behavior. And we really need to take this to heart, because when all is said and done, especially since we have so much more to account for compared to Sardis, we had better realize, and realize quickly, that the last 40 years have proven that the 7th and final church era has gone even farther afield than the Sardis era could have ever gone. So then, whatever happened to Mr. Armstrong? Simple. He died in 1986. And what happened to the gospel message he preached for over 50 years? Simple. It was basically killed off by the Laodicean church leaders who took his place. And what happened to the church that he built as a result of his message? Simple. It became entirely dysfunctional and divided due to those lukewarm leaders who came on the scene after Mr. Armstrong. It's as if all of their ambassador college training had been forgotten, lost, or totally tossed out of the window. This is where we come in. And by we, I mean the Signet Church of God, this new World Tomorrow 2 program, and our new Plain Truth 2 e-magazine. Yes, it's going to take some time to ramp things up, but we would like to urge you to continue watching this program and to visit our websites, because there will be much more coming. Yes, Herbert Armstrong died in 1986. His message was shelved, and the church he built scattered to the four winds. And sadly, it basically remains in that defeated condition to this day. But just know that it is our intent to fix all of it. With God's loving guidance, and by using his inspiration, our desire is to unify and revive God's church and work so we can finish building God's house before Christ returns. Know also that it is fully our intent to do these things Herbert W. Armstrong style. Let's review the scriptural incentive for this approach in this one last verse. Zechariah 4:9. The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house. His hand shall also finish it. That's right. Mr. Armstrong gave us the blueprint for how to build God's house. Or, as it says in verse 9, he laid the foundation of God's house. But as we all know now, Herbert Armstrong didn't live long enough to see its completion. But in verse 9, we can also see that his hand shall finish it. Now, he can't possibly do that himself any longer, so this is where we are going to have to step up. And that's where this new book comes in. This book will explain in much greater detail everything I have covered in this program and much, much more. It also explains what has to happen next as far as reunifying God's people and reviving his work. So my advice is this: don't delay. You can download or order your free copy of Zechariah and the Signet today. You can do so on any of our websites. Links are posted below. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.